Okay, so welcome everybody to FileWave Best Practices. We actually held this same exact session, really, a few months back, and I'm making this recurring. When this ends, a new one will post. I think I might have it too frequent, so I might adjust the next date when I see it, post the updated one at the end of this session in the events channel. Because if not a lot changes, then the YouTube videos can be pretty helpful. And I wanted to show actually and speak to that. So for anybody that doesn't know, we have all these chats and more over on the YouTube, and I'll share the link for that in the chat. But you'll see like the iOS custom wallpaper one, the boosters best practices, third-party patching. So if you missed any of these things, they're posted on YouTube, and then there'd be a great reference. There's even, if you just want to see the videos, not necessarily the Alliance meetings, but there's actually a playlist for the Discord chat specifically that just has those. And I guess the best practices one was just in January. Not a lot changed. The next one should almost certainly be after version 15 comes out, right? Because then things will at least have changed a little bit. Um, so there's that. Um, and then the other ones I have for the discussion here. So I'm going to go through some slides, but this won't just be like a PowerPoint boring thing. I just use the slides so that I talk about each thing, and then I can bring up the admin if there's something to talk about at any point. I hope that you can ask a question in chat or raise your hand to speak, because I want it to be interactive and, for you to get everything that you need out of this. Okay. So to start off, I think it's really important. This article, I point people to it all the time. We add ports from version to version. That's because we're going through a lot of transitions, right? The web admin getting really much more developed was a transition. 0MQ going over to NATs for notifications. It's a pretty big transition. And there's a need to have these separate ports because for a time, 0MQ and NATs both are present. There's just times that you can't just simply replace the port with the same port. So it is important, and we do call this out in the release notes. So I'd say, when version 15 comes out, let's, I guess, talk about this today. Like version 15 is about to come out. We'll send out an email with some bullet points at the top of it with the most important things to think about. And in that list, you might see that there's a new port that you'd have to think about. And it'll point you at this article. If you don't have the ports right, then you'll see things like notifications not working in your admin. You'll see, let me bring up my admin. You'll see instead of everything okay down here, you might see that notifications is red. There's actually another reason unrelated to ports that you could see notifications become unresponsive. We've noticed in the last couple of versions that if a FileWave server is overly busy, so it's just taking a lot of connections, you don't have boosters, but you have maybe 20,000 Windows machines hitting it, then the server becomes so busy that notifications actually start to break. And it's one of the signs that a server's overworked. But if your server, is not currently overburdened, it just always shows a red dot for notifications, you're going to want to think about using the port scanner or the port checker. And I will show you where that is. So I didn't bring that one up, but supportresources.filewave.com has the port tester. So, and I'll share that link too. So there's a little Mac and Windows app. They're pretty simple. They just really drive a Python script that checks for the ports for a server, for boosters, for IVS, and tries to tell you if from the machine you're running it on, can I get to the server on those ports? It's a good thing to run to kind of verify, that you have the things open that you need to. Okay, and I mentioned that we call out the changes in a particular release. This is actually a good example in 14.10. We mentioned that there's a new port, 20,124, and I've seen that port missed. And if you miss that port, then in the web admin or FileWave anywhere, you're gonna see an error about notifications. So we do try to call it out, and if you're keeping up on versions, then just considering whatever's in the latest version note, is probably good enough. Okay, so ports, super important, very, very impactful. And another point that I've recently, in the past couple of months, been doing is making it clearer about the reason for a port. If you see a port in the KB article and you wonder, well, this description doesn't really make sense, I don't know what this does, or which direction is that, what does it mean, you can reach out to us. You can do it through support, or on the KB, when you go there, there's an email address listed, kb@filewave.com. You can shoot an email over there and just say, hey, this is really unclear in this article. And notes like that have been driving a lot of changes in the KB. So if you look at the KB at the bottom here, you'll see recently updated, and there it's a big list of things that are getting updated because of feedback like that. As well, I guess when you're using the KB, we realized 2 years ago that the KB had just a lot of stuff. We did a lot of work to organize things, so there's this navigation over here, can make it easier to drill down and find things. But we've also been experimenting, like everybody else, with using AI. There's this chatbot interface, and you might experiment with this. I'll say we're making it clear it's sort of an experiment, but it can actually make it pretty easy, like, how do I customize iOS wallpaper to have text on it like cereal? I don't know, maybe that's putting too much in the question, but let's see if he gets it right or wrong. Nope, it's getting it right. So it is pretty good. And now it didn't give me where this came from. Where did that come from? So I can ask it, where did it come from? And it gives me the link to the KB article, and I can prove out that that's true by clicking it, and you can see it goes to the article. So I kind of feel like this is a step closer to the way I would imagine a KB should be productive and helpful. There's probably a couple more steps to get there, but maybe you'll find this helpful. Okay. So aside from ports, we talked about that for a little bit. There's also considering whether you run FileWave in a virtual machine that's on premise, a physical machine on premise, or go with hosted. And not everyone knows that we do hosted. If you've been a customer for a long time, maybe you were on premise because we didn't have hosted at the time. But there are pros and cons to being hosted with us. For instance, if you are hosted with us, we do the backups. We upgrade FileWave. We do the OS patches. So you don't really have to think about the server. You'd still need a booster. In fact, if you're on-prem and currently don't have any boosters, when you go hosted, you almost certainly need a booster. Your FileWave server sits in Amazon, and there's some distance, I guess, network-wise, right? You don't know what region the server's running in, as well bandwidth and such. So boosters are almost needed when you're doing hosted. But a booster is a dumb appliance. You can just set one up. It can be CentOS or Windows or Mac OS, whatever works for you. I will say that when you're, and actually we'll get into this more later, but for boosters, think about that a Linux booster can handle 2,000 connections. Mac and Windows are limited to about 400 connections. So you need many more Mac or Windows boosters to do the same work as Linux, although I'm doing some work to prove out if we can do more connections. I have success on the Mac side doing 2,000 connections. Um, I haven't had as much success on the Windows side. Okay, so why you would want to be on premise? Well, if you do Windows imaging today, that's one reason that you'd be stuck with on premise, although we're working to resolve that. Um, FileWave 15 gets us, I guess, with every new release, we're getting a little closer. There's work actively being done to make it so that you can do Windows imaging with a hosted server. And part of that involves where the images live. You might imagine if you're sending a giant image up to a hosted server, well, going to Amazon and coming back from Amazon, it's a big trip. And we don't have as much recovering from errors as we should um, because it was never really geared for that. It was always geared for the FileWave server and the IVS are in the same place. So, so that is one reason. But aside from Windows imaging, we can do pretty much everything in the cloud. We're making a move. Currently, cloud is uh, a VM in Amazon running CentOS 7 that we take care of, which is pretty similar to if you ran the virtual appliance, but hosted in about a month. Will be hosted in a Docker container, and a lot of things will be changing that will make it more for us. You won't necessarily notice this, except that we're working towards things like auto scaling and giving more resources to the system as it needs it. So that we can give even better performance than what we can do today, the way we do it in AWS. Um, and as well, that'll get us away from a dependency on CentOS. And I'll bring this up again later, I believe, but we're going to be announcing some scripts and processes to move to Alma Linux from CentOS. So if you are on premise, you want to stay on premise, you can. If you're running it on CentOS, we have a process to turn that into an Alma Linux server. And Alma Linux is what's replacing CentOS for us. Okay. Now, I mentioned about updates. That's one reason why you would want to be perhaps hosted, right? Because OS updates you don't have to think about. But I would bet that someone here is on-prem and also has not thought about OS updates because we didn't do a great job at pushing folks to realize that it was needed. I've changed the download pages for FileWave to include a yum update command, for instance, which wasn't previously there. If you were simply to install the virtual appliance for FileWave and new versions came out, we instructed you to update the application, but we never really said to do like yum updates for the OS. And that was not great on our part that our documentation was that way. I noticed that, and that's changed for 14.9 and 14.10 on the download pages. You'll see that it leads you to do an OS upgrade as well. So you want to think about it. If you have an appliance, or well, really, this is true for Linux, for Mac OS servers. I almost said Windows, but we don't do that anymore. I guess Windows boosters, it's true for. Make sure the OS is updated. Make sure it doesn't get compromised. So for CentOS, it's really easy to do yum updates. You can see in the little image that's been cycling, it's just the yum update command, and you should see it pull down updates. When we convert over to Alma Linux, there's a different command, DNF update and DNF upgrade. We'll mention those in the KB as we switch over to Alma Linux. But I'm, for instance, the Foundry. that has a lot of training stuff in it. That switched over to Alma Linux yesterday. So we're actively using Alma Linux. It's working great. Okay. Um, so OS upgrades are important. Um, when FileWave releases updates, you have to think about making sure your server, your boosters, your IVS, your clients, that they're all updated. This is another point where I'll see that it won't happen. Parts of this won't happen. So when you're hosted, um, you don't have to take care of the server, but you do still have to take care of your boosters. When you're doing Windows imaging, you have to take care of your IVS and your clients for sure. Because I would see tickets come in, for instance, that would talk about Windows 11 machines that won't run PowerShell scripts, which I know if you're on 14.8 of the client or newer, that's not an issue for Windows 11. So even though somebody's on a newer version of server, they're still running into the problem. And I know pretty immediately that means that they're not doing the client upgrades. And we made a KB article that makes it easy to know what to do. And I believe in 14.10 we included a link to it. And we will definitely, moving forward, always include links to it. So if I go to the knowledge base and I say server upgraded, I think, what next? Let's see, that's some of the words. Here we go. Yeah, your hosted server has been upgraded. What are your next steps? So I'll just copy this, paste it into the chat. So if you're hosted, this gives you the exact steps that you want to do with every upgrade that happens. So easy, simple steps to follow. If you're not, if you're on-prem, then when a new release happens, there's this upgrading your FileWave server article that really is similar to the other one, but deals with an on-prem server and all the steps that you would do, including the server upgrade. So both of these are in the KB and should help you. And you should definitely follow those with each upgrade. Okay. Now, for the clients, a lot of people get tripped up with that. So for the clients, and I think here is another case where maybe we've been a little confusing. In these articles, it will talk about using the upgrade file set. So I want to show you that there's sort of three places that you can get a client. So on the download page, for instance, for Mac and Windows, right, there will be this client installer, right? And I'd say you almost never actually use this client installer. For upgrading your clients, you have the Windows upgrade file set, the Mac OS upgrade file set. These file sets are designed to work when put in your FileWave server to upgrade your clients. They handle the issue of the FileWave client trying to update itself and having to quit and relaunch. So they handle that. Whereas the regular client does not. When it goes to install, it'll actually kill the FileWave client so it's not running, and if you've ever done it, you've run into problems. So you're going to always use this upgrade file set as the thing. You just download it, add it to FileWave. You can drag and drop it into the admin console, associate it with your devices. It knows what versions of Windows or Mac OS it's compatible with. So it won't try to install, for instance, on Mac OS 10.13 because it won't work. We've also updated the compatibility chart to be more clear about what versions are compatible. So when you take a look at this, you will see it explains the three states that a client can be in. And then we do, I think, a better job at the expected to work and legacy version. So expected to work means QA didn't really go through testing on it, but they had in the past, for past versions. We feel like this should still work. Legacy version is we're absolutely not testing it, and we're pretty confident that it won't work with anything newer than what's listed. And I've also taken the step to post these old versions here, so you can actually get to the old versions. So these bit of changes that I've done, I did those with 14.10. So If you didn't notice that yet, that's why, because they're fairly new changes, trying to make it easier for everybody. Okay, so now the other client, I said there were three, is the one on custom.filewave.com. So this one, I would say, is the reason why that client installer, I said I never really use it. That's because I always use this one. Because whether I'm making a Mac or a Windows installer, I fill out all the options that I want to have set and I hit build, and then it will build me a client installer that already knows my FileWave server name, already knows what I want my client password to be, knows that I want to do tracking, knows that I want to use TeamViewer. And we've changed some of the wording here to reflect, that it's for TeamViewer. In booster settings, for instance, you can say ignored for 1480 and above here because this was 0MQ. It's not required. We didn't take it out of this page because people might be building older installers for some reason. But you'll see eventually that this will drop off the page because why should it be an option if it's not part of the product anymore? So this that you would build, you would do for your new installs or your new machine setup process. Um, and yeah, just in general, except for upgrades. Upgrades, you use that upgrade file set. Okay. Backing up the server. This is another thing that has been problematic. I'd say probably the biggest point of suffering for a customer is you go to do an upgrade, it doesn't go well, or suddenly, file sets are corrupted and you don't really know why. Um, Usually, problems with the server most times can be traced back to maybe there was a power outage in the data center and the server shut down unexpectedly, and the storage array that it's on didn't have battery backed up cache, um, or maybe you're running it in VirtualBox on a desktop PC and it lost power. Um, Definitely do backups and don't just back up to the VM itself. So there is a backup script, and it does let you set a target. And that target can be a folder structure on that server. But that backup, using the backup script to the server itself, is no good if the file system becomes corrupt. So you're really going to want to think about making sure that you maybe mount a remote storage place, mount like an SMB share or a Windows share, or an NFS share or whatever you'd normally do to connect to remote storage from if this is running on Linux. If it's running on Mac OS, the same is true. Maybe you want to mount a remote share, make the script point at that mounted volume, have it go there. If you're doing a virtual machine in VMware or Hyper-V, think about VM snapshots. There's a note about turning FileWave services off. I've always felt that was a bit, it's just being cautious when it says it. I could say that I don't necessarily have a case I can point to where there was a problem, but if you can, have FileWave shut down when you do the VM snapshot so that you're absolutely sure that nothing was kind of in the middle of things when it committed. Now, really, with a VM snapshot, it should come out of that 100% okay, but this is just the guidance that support has given. And so there are ways to, if you know the snapshot's happening at midnight, you can have a cron job that maybe shuts down FileWave, for a couple of minutes at midnight, and then the snapshot happens, and then maybe it starts up again. Um, so, or maybe if you can script how the snapshot backup happens, maybe you can shut down the FileWave server, do the snapshot, and then bring it back online. That would definitely have everything off. But definitely have a backup. Definitely have it somewhere other than the server itself. And, doing backups, depending on your rate of change, the weekly or daily, or even monthly, you want to think about that backup. Let's say I'm doing a backup monthly, and then I suddenly got 50 iPads and I enrolled them and I did stuff to them. And now 3 weeks later, the server dies. I have to go to the backup. Well, the the things that happen to those iPads, like their enrollment, isn't in the backup. So maybe your rate of change dictates, how quickly you're making file sets and pushing things out. Where possible, daily is obviously the best for something that's taking care of all your systems. Okay. And then, purging unused file sets. So I've seen a lot of servers that are running out of space, and it's not for any good reason. It's just that, you put things in, you put things in, you put things in, you eventually run out of space. Over here in the FileWave Central, you can see, like on the dashboard, for instance, you can see that how much drive space is used. So this could call attention to it. We do have, and this is covered in a later slide, but I'll speak to it now. There is an alert about free disk space. So you could also have the system tell you. But I would say if you're doing like VMware or Hyper-V, you could set up alerts in there to tell you that you're running out of space in your virtual environment. So, that's something to look out for, that you're running out of space, but also just keeping things clean. So if you look at my server, I keep everything categorized. You'll see an outlier like Nudge here that I was testing for Rudy and support, where I just kind of added it and I didn't put it in the right place, but that's more of an exception. But I do generally group things together. I'll name them appropriately. And that way, when I do something like look at my iOS updates, I could flush out all the like iPad OS 13 or 12. Like I could just select a whole bunch and flush them out. Maybe once a year I do a cleanup of OS updates in particular, and that's one good reason to separate OS updates from other things, is that you can easily spot things and clear them out, because OS updates will take a lot of space. Think about applications that are in here that are not used anymore. VPP apps is another one where I separated out. Now I've separated these and grouped them by function. You might group them by, if you're a school, could be elementary school apps or middle school apps, or school-wide apps. If you're a company, it might be finance, or so you can group them however makes sense to you. But have things organized a bit, and makes it much easier to clean up and know what things are. Think about, if you have a file set in here, like I'll give you an example, the TeamViewer. TeamViewer has in scripts an uninstall. So if I was going through and cleaning up and I had this associated with devices and I wanted to clean it out because it's an old version, I would want to be conscious of, does it have an uninstall, and what will be the consequences of removing it? So think about that. Think about how your stuff works if you tend to do uninstalls, if that would impact things. Think about also on a file set, I meant to go properties. Think about if it's self-healing, for instance, or if it's left behind. Like, think about what's going to happen when you're cleaning up, but definitely clean up. And if you need any help, if you're working with professional services, we can definitely kind of walk through this with you. This is one of the things we do, I think, a lot, is helping with organization and getting rid of the old and maybe rethinking how you structure this. So that's something to think about. Cleanup. Okay. Now, when you clean up, that's not just going to benefit your FileWave server, but it's going to benefit your boosters, because your boosters ideally should be set to delete file sets when they go away. So, if you have wasted space on your FileWave server, then you have wasted space on boosters too. So, okay. So I had just shown this about the alert settings. I believe, then we're going to show, sometimes I lose track of myself. So there are different things that you can get alerts on. And it's super easy. You just pick the things you care about. Do I care about Android EMM if I don't have Android EMM set up? No. So you're going to check the things that matter to you. Um, so just check off the things that you think you want to know about. I put a little message here in the signature bit saying if you're seeing this, you can kind of put instructions in here, things to remind you, like, how you do things, like if your Apple push notification, isn't working, like maybe the KB article for, updating an APNS cert. Um, so you can put helpful stuff in here and it'll come in the email. The email will go here. I believe that you can't put multiple emails in here. That's my memory of this dialogue. But you can put a distribution list. And that's usually, what I recommend, like FileWave at, my company, and then that goes to 10 people if needed. Um, Now, these emails will not, maybe I should put that back. They won't go to anybody unless you go into email settings. And on the next slide, it talks about that. So in preferences, you can set up email. And in this case, we used to use Google until this weekend. Now we use Microsoft 365. But in Google, SMTP, or I should say in Gmail, smtp.gmail.com is what you point at. Um, there's an important article about second factor authentication. So if you're a G Suite user, you know that you can't necessarily just use your plain password when you want to send SMTP messages. You have to set up a password for the application. It's true in Microsoft 365 as well. Um, and Andrew, actually, we should probably make an article about that, like the Google one that I think you made. Um, because you make app passwords in Microsoft too. So you want to make sure that you set that to an app password if you're using Microsoft or Gmail. And then you can send a test email. And if it works, and I will show you, mine works even though it is still set to Gmail because we haven't cut off our Gmail yet. So if I go here, I can say send test email. I'm going to send it to myself. And then you'll see that it'll say successfully sent. That only happens if the mail server receives it and it works. So I actually have to switch this over to point at Microsoft myself. Once that's set up, things like this will work. Another thing that relies on that mail setting is if you've ever looked at assistants scheduled reports, you can actually have the system email you on an interval. So I could do a query and I could say, and maybe I'll show a pre-made one here because this one sends often for me. So I have a query called iPads. So by query, I mean the queries in the left-hand side. Um, so I pick the query by clicking and then picking what query I want. I pick who it goes to. I have a little note saying, attaches the current iPad inventory. I get a CSV file attached to an email, and it comes every week on Monday to me. I should probably change that because that does come to me way too often. But that relies on those mail settings too. Okay. So once you have email going, you have your alerts, then, another thing that can help you is Grafana, both for monitoring and for alerts, because it actually also has something for alerts. And our path forward is really that Grafana really should be the dashboard, even in Central, because Grafana is much more capable. And you'll see as you get to use it. In YouTube, we actually have a video about getting started with Grafana that you can check out. Uh, but I will show you. Let's see if I'm still logged in or not. Nope. means copying my really long password. Okay, so if I go to dashboard here in FileWave Anywhere, you're going to see that they're, similar to in Central. I want to do save. No, I want to do dashboard. Whoops. So similar to the whole green light concept, this will change to red. We do similar in the admin if here. So you'll see, if things, and apologies if my lab doesn't refresh as quickly as a real server. It's kind of overloaded with data and underloaded with resources. So, but you will see this will update and it'll say the thing that it's reflecting and the status. Maybe I'll refresh that, see if it loads. No. So just ignore that for the minute. If yours looked like that, I would open a support case asking about it because it really should show the name and the thing, but my lab is a little questionable. As well, here's the memory, the CPU, how full the file system is, just like in the other dashboard. But a thing about here is there's actually some more dashboards, and you might not know it if you haven't poked around or you weren't on that Grafana session. So if you click up here on FileWave System, you can see that FileWave actually bundles a bunch of dashboards. So you can see things like FileWave System. Well, that was the one that I was on. So what do I want to pick? I'm going to pick host stats. So this will be about the server itself, disk I/O. This one's from the other dashboard, but just a view of what's going on. And if I look at Postgres, that's the database. So you can see how busy or not busy it is. You can see that Redis, which is another data storage thing, how it's performing. In FileWave 15, there's going to be one for NATS, which is the notification system. We updated, we're on version 9.3 something of Grafana. We updated to that a couple of versions ago. We're looking at Grafana 9.4, but 9.3 is pretty current, and you can do a lot of nice visualizations for things. And you might wonder, well, looking at this dashboard is great and all, but how would I use this? There's a school system that Emma and I just visited that they have a big screen in their kind of common room, and they wanted to show multiple bits of data. So on that machine, you can go and you can kind of display it, and there is I could go through different view modes. So this is kind of the full screen mode, but there's also this thing called playlists. So let's say I wanted to make a playlist of like 3 different bits of data, have them cycle, and you can see I have Apache, FileWave System, and host status. Every 5 seconds they cycle. So if I start this and I say that this is a TV, autofit, start test, then it's going to go, and I can make my browser be in full screen mode so it takes up more of the screen. But you see every 5 seconds it cycles through the different displays. So you can show multiple bits of things, and maybe 5 seconds is good. Maybe you want it to be 10 or 30 seconds, but you can show off different things. And if you look at Emma's video on Grafana, getting started with it, you can also show like how filesets are doing. At that school that we visited, we actually showed the progress of re-imaging machines for the summer and a bunch of fuel gauges that show like the percentage complete. So over the summer, as they're re-imaging machines, those fuel gauges will get more and more close to 100% as the different schools re-image machines. So it is pretty helpful, and I can stop the playlist. So I'd say Grafana is pretty helpful. You should take a look at it, especially if you have like a shared space or a network operations center, something with a big screen that you can show off like what's going on. Okay, so now I want to talk about things that are annual or every other year. They happen on an interval, things to think about. Um, your FileWave server, and this is in preferences in FileWave Central, it has an SSL certificate. If you're hosted, you have a FileWave.net. Well, if you're hosted and you have a FileWave.net address, you don't have to worry about this. We handle it. Some hosted people have their own SSL. You want to think about the expiration date. And you can see the expiration date there right on the screen, 6623. So you want to think about making sure that you renew that because otherwise things will break. If you're on-prem, you want to think about renewing it. If you use a self-signed cert, you want to think about maybe moving away from that if you can. There's more and more reasons to have real certificates. For one thing, for security. For another, there's things like Apple's VPP version 2 that has Apple reach out to your FileWave server to tell it that things have happened, and it's going to expect a real SSL cert. So, I think in the future, and actually sort of another example is Windows MDM, where the device reaches out to your server. Now, that's okay if you publish the root certificate or have that cert be trusted through your Active Directory. But depending on the timing of how you do things, it can be inconvenient to have a self-signed cert. Certs are, I mean, you can get them super cheap these days, including Let's Encrypt, which is free. You just have to have a mechanism to update the cert every 90 days. But if you look in Discord, there's a customer that posted a mechanism that they use to update with Let's Encrypt. So definitely doable. The one place that I'd say somebody would be stuck is if you have a server that is on-prem using like a .local DNS name, or I should just say any DNS name that's not like real out in the world, then you can't obviously put an SSL certificate to that, at least not a real one, so easily, and you might have trouble changing over. Um, you can't just change the name of your server because then you have to re-enroll devices potentially. So just something to think about, but definitely work towards having real certificates and real names. Definitely for client management, to have your server available on the internet, because only being able to manage things when they're on your network makes it so it's really hard to patch for things. So I would say you almost certainly want your server out on the internet. Hosted servers are on the internet. Patching them is important. I'll say that when I manage systems, I even back in 2001, I had management systems out on the internet and moving forward. So yeah, it's super important for timeliness of updates. The next thing is the APN certificate. So if you have Apple stuff, then you have the certificate. Think about who updated the certificate. Are they leaving your organization? Do you know how to get into the account that created it? Very important. When I worked at Time Warner, I didn't. This was many years ago. This was over a decade ago. But I didn't realize when we first started doing MDM, probably 2 decades ago, that I should make it in sort of like a company Apple ID. Apple was a little funny long ago where they didn't really like you to make generic Apple IDs. But think about, being able to access where that certificate is when that person leaves, because if you have to change this to a new certificate, so every time you renew, you have to log into that account where that certificate lived. If you don't have access to that, you're going to end up re-enrolling all of your Apple devices because if the certificate changes, then those devices won't trust the new certificate without re-enrollment. So take a look, at this string here because it'll relate to the renewal process, and you'll see it as the topic, I think is the name of it. If this string changes when you update your certificate, then you've made a mistake. Now you can correct it and then put renew it the right way and then put in the new one. But you want to make sure that that stays the same. You want to make sure the expiration date is in the future. So, and this process is in the knowledge base, very easy. Put it on your schedule, so that you handle it ahead of the expiration date. Because if you hit the expiration date, then devices aren't going to talk to your server until you remediate that. So
Yeah, just adding upon that, going back to the APN Apple ID, for some of the newer customers I've worked with, we do stress that even having a personal Apple ID can cause future, next in line administrators to renew that Apple ID for the APN. So I've recommended to create a organization Apple ID for your organization, company, or education. That way, that can be passed down to admin after admin, many years past, so that it is available to everyone. Um, so, yeah,
yeah, because
try
in
not
my
to use a
case,
personal Apple ID. We've seen more cases than not be like, oh, well, they left the company or they left the organization, they moved somewhere else. Well, do you have access to it? No. Well, that can then cause an issue. So, yep.
and that was the case for me when I left Time Warner, and it was in mine because 20 years ago when things all started. Uh, Scary to say 20 years, but um, it was in a personal one, and I actually ended up just giving my coworkers that Apple ID. Um,
Mm,
which at the time, purchasing things on an Apple ID wasn't as big in the beginning. So, I didn't lose all that much stuff, but it was my only real option because otherwise I'd be like, oh no, you have to re-enroll everything, which I wasn't going to do that to them. So
yep.
that is an issue. So then next is, and this goes back to when an upgrade happens. If you manage Mac OS systems using the device enrollment program, the client here in preferences is what gets pushed out. And you'll see in my screenshot it says 14.7.2. And if you manage Mac systems and use DP, um, then you're going to want to look at that and see what version it says. Because if it's an old version, you're going to want to go to that custom.filewave.com site that I was showing to make a custom client. You're going to want to make a new custom client and upload it here. And a little quirk of this dialog is when you pick to upload it and then you pick the file, you need to wait until it says upload complete before you hit OK and go off the dialog. Otherwise, you'll see that it won't really update. Depending on how busy your server is, it might take a minute, but wait for that little confirmation dialog and definitely make sure that you update. Make this one of the things you do when you upgrade. Because, for instance, I'll give you a real example. So, Ventura, when it came out, um, you go and you do DP, and it's for a Ventura machine, and maybe it's pushing out version 14.8, right? Because you hadn't updated it. Um, when 14.8 goes on Ventura, you'll see that it would actually work, but if you had a file set that required Ventura and it was applying, that client would complain that it wasn't compatible. It would say, that it didn't meet the requirements of that file set. And that would seem weird because the file set is set to work on Ventura. That machine is Ventura. Well, it's because 14.8 didn't know that, in fact, even if you have the little checkbox that says to do newer versions, it won't work because Apple does some trickery with version numbers. Ventura is version 13.x, but not really. Inside, it's still 10.18.x. So, because of the funny business that Apple's done with the naming, where internally it's really 10.18, but anywhere that it displays it's 13.x, you'll run into real issues with you know requirements on a file set not working out. But also there could have been new things that Ventura required, and so you don't want to have an old agent going out to your new machines because then you're setting yourself up. In the example I gave before, Windows 11 with PowerShell, if you're doing Windows MDM, well, on the next slide, I believe I show the Windows installer. So Windows MDM uses the installer here, and if it was pushing out 14.7.2, for instance, to a new Windows 11 machine and rolled through MDM, well then PowerShell scripts wouldn't work. So it's it's equally important on the Windows side, but only if you're doing Windows MDM. And for some reason, we don't show the version on this dialog. Um, so I'd say if you just make it part of your upgrade process, I have to make a note for somebody to that we should really display the version that's uploaded there. Okay, so VPP and DEP tokens. This is again, this happens. You'll see a synchronization date. You'll see on the dashboard, you'll see whether a token is coming up for expiration. You'll also see that when Apple releases new major things, like when Ventura came out, that they will break things like DEP for you until you log in and accept the new license terms. So if you see things break and it's ahead of when you've planned to update the tokens, and there are KB articles that take you step by step through updating this. We've recently updated them, so they should be 100% in line with the Apple Business Manager and Apple School Manager portals. But if it breaks and you think it shouldn't have, it could be that Apple has new terms that you have to log into ASM or ABM and accept. Um, there are other things like if you're on-prem and you had to change the IP address of your server, it can invalidate your token. Um, and that actually reminds me, because we're going to be doing some migrations in our cloud environment, that I wonder if we're going to break this. So I'll have to look into that. But renewing these tokens is really easy. It's a couple of minutes, but it's so easy to forget. And you don't want to forget. And then if you're a school, have people say, well, these apps aren't installing. And then you spend a little bit trying to figure it out because maybe you skip past the dashboard and didn't notice that it's red. Um, so, think about this and putting it on your calendar to renew. Okay. Okay. So enough of the sort of the annual renewal stuff. This is more the day-to-day stuff now that will, I guess, help you to have the best performing server it can. Um, so smart groups. So if you look on your server at preferences and then inventory, you should see this refresh every minutes. And if you didn't set up FileWave originally, who knows what number's in there? It probably is good for you to take a look at your server and see what number's in there. It should be 10 by default. Um, if you have a very small server, then putting a lower number you could do. If you don't have a lot of smart groups, then a more frequent refresh is possible. But if you have a very big server, um, the more often this happens, every time it processes smart groups, the server is unavailable for whatever length of time it takes to recalculate all of those smart groups. So you want to think about not necessarily lowering this lower than the 10-minute interval because you're creating little windows where clients can't check in, where admins can't, you know, things are locked up. So think about this number. And so the reason that this is changeable is because depending on your use case, you might actually, let's think about the beginning of a school year. Schools are great because you actually sort of have a start and an end, where companies are kind of continuous all the time. Um, for school, the new school year is coming, and you have a lot of smart groups that dictate what software gets installed. You might lower this, to happen more frequently, to make sure as you're rolling out devices, those things happen more frequently, but knowing that you're maybe making some extra burden on the server. Um, so you may then, once you get through that initial thing, put it back to the 10 minutes, or maybe you need it to refresh less often because that changing of smart groups causes software to install, and maybe you don't need it to happen, as frequently as every 10 minutes. The bigger the number can be, the easier it is on your server. It's as simple as that. And you probably also want to think about, you know, looking at the CPU load, looking at the RAM load on your server if you manage your server. Um, because if you find, I've had this a couple of times where there were servers with pretty default settings, and they weren't performing very well. And then we took a look and we looked at the number of virtual CPUs and the amount of RAM, and we had to make some tweaks. And in one case, we started off with two CPUs, and we ended up with 16 CPUs in the end. We were just watching, the performance of it to be able to tell, whether we were having a positive effect. We looked at the RAM use on the server itself. So think about that, because you could make this more frequent if you need, but think about the impact to your server. And if you're hosted, there are ways we can make your server have more resources. Just work with us about, why you need to do it. We'll figure it out. Okay. So the next thing that gets people all the time is when you launch FileWave Central, if you ever see that inventory queries is basically blank, nothing shows for maybe some number of minutes every time you launch it, and then all of a sudden the ones you have selected will pop out. Um, and probably if you see this, you don't just have a couple like I do, you have a lot of queries, and maybe queries that have a lot of results. Um, so what happens is it has to process all of these before it actually displays them. So if you're kind of okay with that, waiting for a couple of minutes, then okay, but just know that the more things that you have enabled over here, it has to keep refreshing those, and that's creating work on your admin. And so you want to think about, you can see I don't have everything selected, and it's for a reason. But if there's something that I want, I guess, to always see on the left hand side with a count, that's the kind of thing that I want over here. Like in my example, I want to know my Windows 11. I want to know the difference between Monterey and Ventura versus all Mac OS. Like if I need this, then I should have it selected. But think about if you have a lot of things over here and you don't need to look at the numbers, constantly off to the left. If it's good enough that you come to inventory queries and then, double click on this to bring it up, and then boom, it's, over here. Actually, I think I said double. Yeah. Okay. I didn't mean to edit that one. I guess I must have clicked it in a way that it went to edit. But yeah, I double clicked on that one, it opened the tab, and I get to the data pretty quick, and it doesn't burden your admin. So if you've ever seen that delay in these showing up, that's why. Also look for queries that have, like, I was working with somebody and there was a query that showed, I think it was over 1 million results, and they have 8,000 devices. So I said to myself, this is probably a slow query. Um, and then they mentioned to me that that particular query didn't reflect what they wanted. Like they were kind of working on it. It was work in progress. And so not only was it slow, but it also didn't really do what they wanted. So it wasn't really great. So we deselected it, so all we'd have to do is say, okay, that one goes away. So think about that. The other thing is, and there's another point about a query versus a smart group, because this one is, I guess, a much bigger uh, performance thing. So smart groups are reevaluated every 10 minutes by default, right? Queries are reevaluated, perhaps it's the same interval, but it's on your machine that a lot of the work happens. Um, in queries, they're running 24 hours a day, no matter whether admins are running or not. They're just doing their thing. They're also creating these ID numbers for every clone that appears. So if I go here and I make a smart group, devices that connected in the last 5 minutes, you can imagine that a lot of devices will come in here and leave here rapidly, which means ID numbers are getting created. And if in your server you don't have these nice low numbers like I do, but rather you have numbers that are in the billions, then you probably have some queries like that. And they're just more expensive, I guess, for the server to have these as queries, or sorry, as smart groups, because because of that processing, just the way it works. So I always think of it like, if I'm going to use it to deploy content, then I definitely want it to be a smart group, right? Um, so, for instance, a smart group based on like school, where I have a custom field that defines the school and the grade level, that makes sense because I probably have file sets that I deploy to the school. I probably have profiles that I deploy. In a company, it makes sense to have departments in here. Um, but it doesn't make sense to make a smart group that is devices that checked it in the last 5 minutes. It can be tempting to do that because you can change the columns here, and this feels a lot like a report. But that is much better for queries for performance reasons. So definitely think about that. And that work to make those ID numbers and create records and inventory, it's just a lot more work. So um, try and think about moving towards queries instead of smart groups where it's appropriate. Okay, so I talked about boosters before, and boosters are super important, perhaps even more important these days, especially if you're hosted. So you can see on my server, I have two boosters set up. Um, that's mostly just for experimenting, but there's a couple of things about boosters. There's the booster config, and there is a YouTube video posted on booster best practices. But if I go, and in my case, booster monitor, I have to launch separately. One sec. So here we go, because the IP address that shows up in here is not really the IP address I have to get to it on. So because we do a thing with it sits in a DMZ of sorts. So there's preferences for the booster, and oops, if only I didn't typo that. And so for the booster itself, and this is covered in the booster best practices, very important, the maximum number of connections. It'll default to like 400, or in fact, older Mac boosters, you'll actually see 101 connections. Um, they can handle more connections. So Mac and Windows 400, Linux can handle 2000. It's why I really push for this until we make it so that Mac and Windows boosters can handle more. But this is important. Delete unused file sets. You probably want this checked because this means when a file set gets deleted on the FileWave server, it deletes from the booster. In the KB, it talks about maybe deselecting this to keep like a backup of file sets, but I don't know, that logic doesn't really make sense to me because you can back things up anyway just by exporting them or just through backups. So I think this really, there's not a use case that I can think of where I would not check this. I'd always have it checked. Um, and then down here, server one is the DNS of the server. In my case, there are scenarios where it could actually be another booster. I talk about that in the booster best practices. It's worth watching that video if you haven't looked at boosters. But the other half of this is the superpref or custom client config. So you have to tell your clients about boosters too. So you could use a superpref to tell them kind of after they're deployed. You can use a custom created client to tell them about it before they're deployed. But you can give them up to 5 boosters. They will go from booster 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, trying them until they have success. There's one customer I'm working with where they have 2 boosters for the internet, and the rest of the boosters are like local at a particular school. So, and in their environment, they actually have 2 data centers. So my recommendation was, um, Booster 1 is the school booster that's in data center A. Booster 2 and 3 are the two internet-facing boosters. And then booster 4 is a backup booster that's in data center B. So if data center A goes down, they can reach data center B. The reason we did that was they'll kind of hit that first one. If it's down, maybe it's because they're at home. So it'll go to those outside ones. And then lastly, it'll hit another internal one if it's the case that the data center's down. So depending on your setup, we might do different things. As we chat, there's all sorts of ways to configure this. I have another customer where they use 4 boosters. They're all Linux boosters. They're all on the internet, and everybody hits all 4, but in a different order. So it is kind of an art form to set this up. And so you can chat with us about it in PS. You can ask support questions. There's knowledge base articles about it. But if I go to, let's go to custom. So if I go here and I'm making my client installer, there are booster settings here. So let's say booster1.filewave.com. There's this booster routing checkbox that you definitely want to check. You want to make sure that you check it. And then I could have booster2.filewave.com. So in this scenario, when I produce a client installer, they're going to know about these 2 boosters right from the start. But you can also go here to the superprefs editor that you have on any machine that has FileWave admin. And superpref editor lets you change settings kind of after the fact. And there's a good KB article on it. Here I can define booster1.filewave.com. I should put in the port, which should be 213, 20,013. The publish port of 20,003. It's not a bug that these are don't let you put it in for these. It's that for 0MQ, it only mattered for the first booster. If you're on FileWave 14.9 or 14.10, this doesn't actually matter at all, this publish port. In fact, when we release version 15, I believe this column may be deleted from the superpref editor. So I can put in my boosters, and you'll see that this is grayed out. Now, you want to make sure to put a port in here if you're using superprefs, because I had somebody where they didn't. It was just the 0 like default. They pushed out the superpref, and it didn't use those boosters because the clients thought that the port was 0. Now, I think that was poor on us because we didn't have it default to the numbers we would expect. If you look in the KB, you'll see the screenshots have the numbers in it. They mention it, but we really should have had that defined from the start. We should also, encourage you to check this here and give you a reason to want to check it. Perhaps check it by default once you put a booster in. So my advice would be always check this. In the KB, it talks about why there's a few extra things that a client will do with a booster directly if you have this checked. And the goal of boosters is to take traffic away from the server, to shield the server from direct client traffic. Boosters are the best way for Mac and Windows clients. Other types of clients don't use it. If you have iPads, for instance, then an Apple caching server is your best bet. Apple caching servers are really easy to set up. There's a KB article, I believe, on it. There's a Discord channel for sure on it. And it is really easy to set up a caching server. Your Macs will benefit from a caching server as well for VPP apps. Okay, so boosters for sure, route messages I said, and check out the booster best practices if you want to see. About an hour was spent, I think, on boosters, and you should be really good on the topic once you watch that. And I cheated because I already showed you this dialogue, and I already talked about the connections. So that's fine. I talked about why delete unused file sets should be checked. I talked about file set organization already, so that's good. It really just makes for better cleanup. And you can see this is an example when my server was really messy and not organized. And when everything's sitting at the top level, spilled out here, um, it becomes really hard to clean up. You start to lose track of things. So, cleanliness is good. So then, there is sort of this topic of custom fields. So custom fields, if you're not using them, then probably you'll see that it's blank. Although you should probably check it out if you weren't the person that set up your FileWave server. So in FileWave Central, if I go to Assistance and then Custom Fields, Edit Custom Fields, you can see that I have a collection of custom fields. Um, custom fields are great um, in a lot of cases. So, like for Mac and Windows, they can run scripts and put data into FileWave. For iPads, where you can't run scripts, you can still use it for things like what school is it assigned to, or what role does it have, student or staff, or role could it be something like finance versus IT if you want to think about departments. So you can use that for saying what a device is to think about assigning content based on that custom field. And custom fields are great because you can import from a CSV file. So you can do bulk changes to say, okay, for this year, these 100 iPads are now student devices, which causes them to get assigned the proxy profile and some other stuff that's student related. Um, so custom fields can be a really good way to make devices fall into a smart group to get policies or file sets, for software. But they can be bad if these scripts consume a lot of processing time. They run every 24 hours, or when a verification happens, which is every 24 hours. They run at boot time as well. So if you had, and I'll tell you, when Tony Keller and I managed systems, we had about 150 custom fields because we went a little crazy. They were very helpful. All of them were super helpful, but we had to be very mindful that 150 scripts were running pretty often on devices. We had to think about how much work those scripts did. For a lot of them, it was asking Spotlight about information about applications. Um, but, and that was pretty quick. But, think about what they're doing. I have these simple ones that read in like booster settings, and these client config ones are actually in the knowledge base, in the booster articles, telling you how you can tell how your clients are configured. So this one just reads a key, very easy, not a lot of load at all. You know, um, this one asks software update to list all the updates that are pending, and then it tries to spit out a list. Well, software update does put a little bit of burden, takes maybe a minute or two to process. And on the Windows side, we create a Windows update session and we try and see what updates are needed. So I would say this would be like of medium concern to me because it's, doing something that might take a little bit of time. And think about it that all the scripts have to run through, to complete an inventory. So just think about that, the effectiveness. If you have custom fields that are from a previous administrator and you have no idea why they have them there, they don't, like this one, although I think I added a U here at some point. So max battery capacity. If you're not using the data, if it's there from a previous admin, it makes sense about what it does and what it is. You could delete it, if you have no need for it. Um, so just a cleanup there is important. You also want to think about this assigned to all devices. If it's not assigned to all devices, who is it assigned to? If it's assigned to 3 devices and it was a field like this, then is it really used? I don't know. Um, I used to have a field that would capture part of my client logs, and that got really, really big. So something like that for troubleshooting is helpful, but it's only going to be assigned to a couple of devices where I want to maybe pull in something from some log file that I can't get through the UI. Um, so, and then so that bit about returning large amounts of data, you're going to think about the impact on your server. Even if you have boosters, um, Mac and Windows systems will return their inventory to the FileWave server itself. They do not hand their inventory to the booster. I wish they did, um, because that would be sort of the one of the remaining things that it goes to the server for. But that inventory data is getting handed directly back to the server, even with boosters. So, and then as far as presentation goes, slides, those are kind of the things to think about. I did guess correctly on time this time, so we didn't run over. We have a couple of minutes left, like 13 minutes left. But I wanted to ask, I did a lot of talking. Does anyone want me to jump back to a topic or to talk about a topic that I missed? And you can raise your hand or use the chat. Or I covered a lot of stuff, or you fell asleep because it is not the most exciting of topics. It's kind of a checklist, this session. It's more, you know, the things you have to do to keep your server happy. While we see if anybody has questions, I will say that we're planning to have sessions on migrating an on-premise server over to Alma Linux, from CentOS to Alma Linux. We do have scripts to do it. We just have to put together the articles. Um, and we do plan to have sessions when version 15 comes out, which should be at the end of May, I believe, or maybe mid-May, to cover. They'll be specific, topic specific, like we did the iOS wallpaper session for version 14.10. So we'll pick out little features and have really shorter sessions that focus on those specific topics, so you can pick and choose what you want to be on. So I know the list of events looks a little dead right now, but it will then get a few more events as soon as we get closer to 1410. Andrew, any tips or anything you think I missed or I should go back to, just from your perspective?
No, I think a lot was covered. I guess I don't know if you talked about it, but with boosters, if you do have multiple boosters, there is a 10-minute delay of if a booster is not connected, a client can't connect to the booster. It will take up to 10 minutes, and if it's not available, then it proceeds to the next in line that you have configured in the SuperPref. So I know some people will say, well, how come it hasn't connected to the next booster? Well, if you look at the logs of the client, it will have that 10-minute attempt, and then it will then proceed on to the next booster. So if you do have some clients not getting file sets, but you do have a booster set up, and if that booster is not available, like you said, it's only internal and not externally available, it will take up to 10 minutes until it does cascade down to the next booster in line and then receive the file set.
Yeah, that is I think I talk about that in the booster best practices one. Um,
But I know some people will say, well, how come it did get a booster? Well, if it's not available, it will take 10 minutes until the next one is available. Yeah.
the other thing it'll do is, let's say booster one was really unavailable, like, and it did manage to fail to booster two. Um, then after about an hour, after exactly 1 hour, the client will try and see, is booster one reachable and usable again. And so they will try and seek out their first booster after an hour. So same thing will happen if none of the boosters are available. and it fails to the FileWave server directly, after about an hour, it will again seek out a booster to connect to.
And I guess don't put the FileWave server address in the client preferences for boosters because I've seen that happen and it just loops over and over and over again
Oh,
because it's
yes.
trying to reconnect.
So here, if I, so you're saying on this boosters, if we were imagining this was also, you can manage client preferences. So if this is my FW Josh lab,
Yep.
so you've seen people do like this.
Yep. And it will just loop because it's attempting to connect to that booster, but it's actually the server, so it kind of mess it up.
And I think I know why somebody ends up doing that. And I'll show this reason. Maybe it'll stick in people's head. Um, when you go to custom.filewave.com and you build a booster installer, and I talk about using this as my, and I actually talk about this in the session on boosters. Um, here, for a booster, server one is
Yep.
usually, right? So here, conceptually, for a booster, server one is the server, but for clients, server one is a booster generally.
Correct. Yep.
And that, I think, is why somebody would go down that road. And that's another example where, maybe we should have a little explanation to the side here where saying usually this is your FileWave server. And, same thing in the SuperPref editor where we would say this would not be your FileWave server, generally. So, yeah, I can't
Yeah.
think of a reason in SuperPref editor that it would ever be, um, where it would ever be where server
FileWave
one would be
server.
the server. I don't think it would ever be in the SuperPref editor.
Mhm.
So, okay.
Yep. Just yeah, those custom fields that we've created in the KP documentation is really helpful too. So it really keeps track of, hey, let's just go through and check some of the clients randomly. And you can look in the device details and then see, yep, they are properly configured to connect to those boosters that you've set up.
Yeah, and just these articles, you can see I went to FileWave multi-platform topics, boosters, and then there's a bunch of topics here, and there is config this one, booster modern configuration settings. There's this reporting. This is the custom fields that Andrew was mentioning that I had in my server that you can just download and add to your server and be able to see your config because pretty much in every case when I've worked with somebody, the way they believed it was configured was not always the way it was actually configured. Um, and we've been looking more at what fields should just be built in, like why should those be custom fields? And you'll see over time that fields will get added. There were fields that were originally in this pack of custom fields that we would use in PS, where a couple of them we removed because they're now in the product. So I think you're going to see, like in version 15, that there'll be some more fields for reporting things because over time things get added. In particular, I think the status of MDM commands. Um, there'll be more exposure about what's happening with MDM commands to iPads and macOS and tvOS devices. So, but I could see these not being a KB thing to add in the future. That maybe we just say, hey, these fields could be used and they're built in. So, okay, well, have about 5 minutes. So if you've thought of anything you want to ask, we're happy to answer. Otherwise, we'll be on Discord for anything anybody needs.
I think I saw some people typing, but I guess they I don't know.
Maybe we answered the thing that they were typing preemptively.
There we go.
Okay. You're welcome, Eric.
Yep.
Okay, thanks, guys. This will get posted on YouTube. So let me stop recording.